more than one occasion, I've bitten off a bit more than I can chew. I'm sure you find yourself in that same place as well, where you have this idea. And it's a really good idea. It's so good of an idea that you start jotting things down. You put it onto the back of a napkin. It's so important, right? You put it onto a piece of scratch paper. And maybe if it's really important, you get out a fresh sheet of paper and you start jotting things down. And if it's something that you're building or if it's something that you're making, you might write down a blueprint so you can get a better picture of what it might look like at the end. Like combining a living room and a dining room and a kitchen. I had that idea once. It was a really good idea. It would have looked really good when it was done. But the more I got into the project, the more I started looking at what it would take to accomplish that project. I had to put a beam in there at some point so the roof would hold up, because I'd have to take several different walls down. And I'd have to reroute the plumbing. I would have to rerun the electric. I would have to remove windows and board them up and create new windows. And I'd have to even go on the outside of the building, outside of the house, and reside the building or reside the house. It got to a point where I had to take a step back and say, what is it that's important? Is having this one great room important, or is my marriage important? Is my family important? Because I could have done the project. I could have started tearing down walls, and man, it would have looked really good when it was done, maybe 2 years later. But during that construction phase, what would it have done to the relationships within the household? I had to remember that those were important. I had to remember that having a roof over my head was what was important. We all fall into this category of people where we get involved in something, whether it be in our families, these relationships that we have in our families, or in our neighborhoods, or relationships that we have at the job site, or projects that we have in the home, or projects that we have at work. We all fall into a category of people where we get involved in something. And we have this idea of what it would look like when we first start. But the more we get into it, and all of these different circumstances, and all of these different variables that tend to come into our view, changes what we find ourselves in the midst of. And the project turns into something greater. Like trying to make a great room out of a kitchen, living room, and dining room, but yet having to go on the outside of the building just to reside the entire wall of the house. And you have to kind of determine, what's important? When we get involved in all of these different things in life, we get ourselves up to our elbows in relationships. We get ourselves involved in up to our elbows in details that we really weren't anticipating, that we really weren't figuring would be in that project or in that circumstance that we found ourselves. And when we find ourselves there, we get frustrated with the circumstances because they've changed. We wanted things to stay the same. And we thought, well, if these things stay the same, then we'll be able to accomplish this here in 6 months. But 12 months later, you're not able to get any further down the road than where you were at the beginning. We get overwhelmed with different things that tend to pop up. We get overwhelmed with different options that tend to be laid out in front of us, or different obstacles that are laid out in front of us. And we start wondering, well, what do I do first? And we just kind of go from one to the next and wander aimlessly because we really don't know which one to attack first or which one to start first. We find ourselves arguing about trivial matters with other people that might be involved in that project, that really are ancillary or really off to the side rather than that main part of what it is that you're trying to accomplish with the project or with the people that you're involved with. And it's at that point where we have to do something to distance ourselves from the project or what lays in front of us, and take a step back and reset the foundation. This same thing is true in our journey with Jesus. because it's no different than any other aspect of life. Our journey with Jesus is part of our life. And so in our journey with Jesus, we often find ourselves there that, this Christian journey that I started 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5 hours ago, this journey with Jesus that I started a while ago, I had this idea of what it would look like in my mind, and I even started making plans for it, but 5 years later, 10 years later, 15, 20 years later, man, it's not quite where I thought I would be in my journey with Jesus. Because it doesn't matter how old we are, it doesn't matter how mature we are. We find ourselves needing to reset the foundation. To take a step back for a moment and assess and look at what it is that lies ahead of us. And reset the foundation, because we get into scenarios where we need to be reminded that the power of the gospel is the foundation for unity. That the gospel that we embrace, this gospel that we hold on to, there's a power that comes with it. And it provides unity for people that are walking this journey with Jesus together. Last week, we took a look at a group of people, the Corinthians, that Paul is addressing in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And one of the things that we saw last week, the main thing that we saw last week, was that these people were living in disunity. They weren't all focused on that important aspect of the gospel. This morning as we dive into 1 Corinthians, I'm hoping that there's one thing that we will see from the text that we're looking at today in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. I'm hoping that there's one thing that we can see, and that is how we are certain to move in one direction. How is it that a group of people that say we love Jesus can be certain to move in the direction of unity? And we'll see that there's two ways that we can do that. One is that embracing by what we're called to, and second is that we go back to that sure foundation, that we go back to a solid starting point. This past week I was reading through a couple of different news articles, sports articles. I like football, and I like the team from Ohio, the Buckeyes. It's a college team. And a couple years ago, there was a quarterback that played for them his name was Dwayne Haskins. And you may have heard, if you follow any sports, you may have heard his name in the news, because he played for the Washington football team, for the NFL, on a professional level. And last Sunday, he actually started the football game. He was their starter for several games this year, and the starting quarterback for several games last year. So you would think, man, he has a pretty good thing going forward. But what happened this past week is they cut him. They let him go. And they said, we no longer need your services. Now, this guy, Dwayne Haskins, has all of the skills and all of the talents to play at the next level. He's got a rocket of an arm. He can throw the ball 50, 60, 70 yards in the air. He has all of the skills to play at that level. But what he didn't do is he didn't recognize the place in life where he was. He didn't recognize the gravity of that place in life. He wasn't mature enough. He was immature, and he wasn't mature enough to handle what was it that lied ahead of him. He wasn't willing to put in the time at practice. He wasn't willing to put in the time in the film room. He wasn't willing to take a look and see where it was that he needed to improve. He made some pretty silly decisions that put other people in harm's way. And we often look at this and we just kind of shake our heads and say, you know what, that next generation, they're just so immature, they don't know what they're doing. And we just kind of shake our heads at them. We've all been there, where we kind of look at the people that are coming up behind us and say, man, They need to get their act together. You know, and Paul could have done the same thing with the Corinthian believers. He could have shook his head and he could have written them off. Said, you guys have no clue what you guys are doing. And they didn't. Because they're only Christians for at most 5 years. Paul spent 18 months with them. And this letter is believed to be 2 to 4 years after him spending 18 months with them. So some of these Christians were brand new Christians. They had no idea what this whole Christian journey was about. So he would be right. You have no idea what you're into. But instead, he calls the immature followers of Jesus to realize their potential. You know, even as seasoned followers of Jesus, we find ourselves floating along in this Christian journey. We find ourselves floating along as Christians, yet not giving much thought as to what that actually means. And Paul, he lays out what that means, that what we've been called to. And he says, what you need to do, Corinthians, what you need to do, Pleasant Hillers, is that you need to realize and embrace what you're called to. That number one, you're called to be saints. This has everything to do with who we are, our identity. You know, we look at sainthood. Some of us may have grown up in a tradition where being a saint comes after somebody dies. That there's this council that looks at a person's life and it looks at what they've done and if there's a miracle that's been done and if they've done good and if they've caused a change in this world. And they say, that's a saint. And so there's a few select people that are considered to be saints. Or maybe you grew up in a tradition where a saint was someone that, you know, they teach from the Bible. They live an exemplary life. And that's a saint right there. I'm not a saint because I can never live that way. But sainthood, in Paul's minds, what he's telling the Corinthians, is that sainthood, being a saint, is not about your actions. It's about an identity. Because remember, he calls them saints. He says that you are called to be saints. Remember who these Corinthians are. They're arrogant, they're self-dependent, they're bad at conflict resolution, they're inconsiderate, they're unloving, they're selfish, they're living for themselves, they're living to live it up here and now. But yet, he calls them a saint. He says that you need to be saints. And you might say, well, I don't feel like a saint. I don't act like a saint. Well, welcome to the crowd. Because I don't know if any of us would be able to say that we live like a saint, we act like a saint. Because in Paul's teaching, in Paul's minds, being a saint is not what we do. It's all about the position that we have in Christ. That if we are followers of Jesus, if we have confessed our sin, if we have embraced Jesus and said, I'm going to follow you, then you are a saint. And Paul is saying, live like that. Well, what does a saint look like? He says in verse 2, to the church of God that is in Corinth, to those sanctified in Christ Jesus. Now, this idea of church, we think of a church as, you know, a building, or we think of a church as something we do on Sunday. And to a degree, that's very true, because you have to kind of put ourselves in the minds of the Corinthian believers that they didn't have 2,000 years of church history to kind of define what a church is. The word that Paul uses is basically, it's a gathering of people that have been called out of their home into the public square for a certain purpose. And so that's their idea of a church. I mean, if you go back to Acts chapter 18, the passage that we looked at last week, there was a church there in Acts chapter 18 that pulled the leader of the synagogue out into the public square and beat him in front of the Roman government. That was a church because they were called out of their homes into the public square for a certain purpose, for one particular purpose. But Paul is saying that is not the church that you need to be. You don't need to be a church that beats people up. You're not the church of any god or goddess. You're the church of God. You're the church of the one true God. He goes on to talk about how they're sanctified, and we don't use the word sanctified a whole lot in our everyday language. But sanctified means that person or something that's been set aside for a certain purpose. And Paul leans on Old Testament thinking here. We can go back to Leviticus, and we can go back to Exodus and look to see a little bit more, get an understanding of what this means to be sanctified. If we looked at Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 and 2, God is talking to Moses. And he's saying, hey, you guys need to be holy. The nation of Israel, you've been called out of Egypt, and you're now entering into the promised land, and you need to realize that you need to be holy because I am holy. That's the purpose that you have been called out amongst these other nations. You are set apart to be holy because I am holy. In Exodus chapter 19, after leaving Egypt, this kind of goes back to when the nation of Israel just left Egypt. He says that you've been set apart for certain norms and certain standards and certain practices. And Paul is saying to the Corinthian believers here that you are a gathering of people for the purpose of being representatives of God's kingdom to those who don't know God. You've been set apart to obey. You know, man, when we look at sainthood, looks at the outward part and says, see what it is that I have done. But when God looks at a saint, what he's looking for is, who are we in Christ? And it doesn't matter. We don't always act like saints. We don't always talk like saints. Our interactions with people is not always that. But we would say, man, Jeff's a saint there. He just yelled at somebody. That's not what sainthood is. Sainthood has everything to do with identity. That eventually works itself out. And we act that way. And that's what Paul is saying, is that realize that you've been called to be saints. Because our first calling has to do with identity. And understanding that our identity in Christ is what defines us as saints. And when we grab a hold of that, when we grasp a hold of who is making that calling on our life, when we grasp a hold of the grace that has been extended to us, it makes us reconsider. It makes us think, man, yeah, this area of my life, I'm not acting like a saint, but man, I can do something to change it so that I act like a saint, so that my identity matches up with my actions. And that's what Paul is calling the Corinthians to live out this grace that has been given to us.